Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here with Fred Lane, Frederick S. Lane to be exact, and Fred has just completed a new book, Cybertraps for the Young. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Lauren Glenn.
Now, you're known in the Channel 17 circle as having served on the Burlington School Board for many years.
10 years, actually.
10 years, that is many years.
Yes, it is.
But you've also are an author of many books, and as I recall, several of them are on this topic.
They're related to this. This is actually the 6th book that I've published. 3 or 4 of the books that I've written have dealt with various aspects of technology, the rise of the online adult industry, for instance, workplace privacy concerns, that kind of thing. So this book is the first, I think, that really addresses the concerns of parents and kids. And what's different about Cybertraps for the Young is that most of the parenting safety books approach this issue from the perspective of kids as potential victims online, which is obviously a real concern. Lots of parents have legitimate worries about that. But this book looks at a different issue, which is the possibility of kids becoming perpetrators online, actually committing crimes either knowingly or unknowingly through what they're doing on the internet.
Well, let me just start from the point of view of my 11-and-a-half-year-old. As I mentioned to you, we were recently on a trip, and halfway through the trip, she informs me that she is Skyping her friends. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, you know, that's okay. But what I didn't really realize was that she had obviously created a little Skype account for herself, mm-hmm. And I wasn't aware of that. And so we were talking about ground rules.
Right.
And sort of stopping the madness before it starts. And I just wonder what kind of advice, like what kind of conversation do you have with your 11-year-old who's being sucked into the vortex of the online world?
It's a great question. The most important thing is the piece you underscored, the idea of having conversations with your kids about what they're doing. And this is not a one-shot deal, obviously. This is, you know, really a conversation that runs over a period of weeks or months or even years to really understand how they use the internet, what they want to do with the computer, who they're talking to. I mean, these should be the kinds of questions that every parent is routinely asking their child. And honestly, the sad thing is that, yes, it needs to go beyond that sometimes, because we all know that kids don't necessarily reveal everything that they want to do or are doing online. So sometimes it's necessary to actually go into the computer, either yourself if you know how to do it, or with someone who does, to see what programs are installed. I mean, one of the advantages of Skype is that you can't operate it unless you've installed the software. And it shows up when you look for it. It's in the list of programs. So you can educate yourself about the kinds of things that have been installed. The other thing is, too, that with a little bit more effort, you can also see what kinds of websites your child is visiting and get a sense of what they're doing. Are they visiting chat rooms? Are they downloading software? What kinds of games are they playing? And those are all useful pieces of information, particularly from the potential of a child as a victim. For instance, you wouldn't want your 11-year-old to have a list of friends that you don't know, or that raise concerns that maybe someone is trying to reach out to her. But at the same time, you want to be in a position to know if she's using Skype or some other communication tool to, for instance, bully someone, in which case now she's potentially a perpetrator as well.
So I know this sounds like a really stupid question. I mean, I feel like I should know the answer, but what is the conversation that I have? I mean, we have rules in our house about television watching, mm-hmm. and that seems pretty cut and dry. Mm-hmm. In our house, for example, Friday, Saturday nights, you can watch a movie. We're obviously not big media consumers in the child realm, but
right.
So now I want to have a conversation and say to her, there are certain conditions under which you can use this piece of equipment.
Right.
So what are examples of guidelines that I might give for her?
Sure. I think that one of the immediate conditions would be that you need to tell me what communication tools you're using, what accounts. Like, for instance, the fact, I think you would want to sit down and say, I found it very disturbing to discover that you had an account on this communication medium and I didn't know about it. And so if that happens, then you lose the ability to use this device, because I'm not comfortable with you communicating with really the world without my knowing that you're doing it or how you're doing it. So that would be the first thing. And then I think the ongoing conversations are much more along the lines of who are you communicating with on a regular basis? Can you show me your list of friends? Presumably she has a list of contacts on Skype. And walk through, who's this? Are these kids you know? Are these parents of kids? That kind of thing. If there's a name there you don't recognize, then you want to know who that is. Then beyond that, I think that what this book does is it identifies the kinds of crimes that kids can commit. And so you really want to spend some time talking through with her the very real consequences of misusing this equipment. And obviously it has to be age appropriate, and it's tuned to your child's computer capability. If she's not spending dozens of hours per week on the computer, she's probably not hacking into other computer systems. But you want to lay the groundwork for why that's a bad idea. And so part of it is, are you using this communication tool or your cell phone to harass any other kid? And here's what would happen if you did that, and here's why that's a potential problem. Or are you using the computer to download free music? That's actually a violation of federal law. And that information can be tracked by the music companies. And if you download music that you think is free, there's a very real possibility that the entire family could get in trouble. And so you need to be aware of that.
So what are some of the other cyber traps? You've just mentioned a couple of them.
Sure. I mean, what the book does is it runs through about 8 or 10 different cyber traps that people need to be aware of, and there are variations on some of them, so it's a pretty comprehensive list. For young kids, obviously, the most immediate risk that you run into is the misuse for cyberbullying or bullying, because particularly with middle schoolers who tend to be in the sweet spot now for smartphones and Facebook pages and all the rest of that, there's a real possibility that playground communications will spill over to these other devices or to these devices. And so obviously in Vermont we've made a real effort to cut down on cyberbullying and bullying in general, but it is potentially a crime. It's certainly a violation of school rules and so forth, so there's that. There's a real risk that your child might be misusing the equipment for academic dishonesty. So you need to have a conversation with your daughter, for instance, about what kind of material can you get from the web and how can you use it. And there's the obvious thing, the idea that you don't take a Wikipedia article and turn it in as your own work. But where's the boundary there? How do you appropriately use material? Or are they using a smartphone in school to cheat by taking photos of quizzes for their friends or something like that? All of these things have really serious ramifications. As they get a little bit older, you run into potential issues in terms of cyber harassment, where there's actually an ongoing campaign to bully, but in a much more aggressive way, someone online, or perhaps setting up a fake Facebook page that pretends to be some child's, and then using that Facebook page to get that child into trouble. I mean, that's called bullying by proxy, and that's actually been a fairly common incident around the country. It's actually happened to teachers as well, where students would set up a fake Facebook page for a teacher and then post things to that page that made it look like the teacher was a molester of some kind or a drunkard, and there have been teachers who have been fired as a result of that. It's really stunning. So there's that. But then if your child becomes much more adept at using the computer, you start to have concerns about hacking. You start to have concerns about other kinds of computer intrusions and so forth. That's a pretty small subset, but it's definitely out there. One of the real concerns for parents, particularly given the rate at which we're giving kids smartphones with cameras, is this idea of sexting. And the basic concept behind sexting is that kids are using phones to send nude or semi-nude photos of themselves to boyfriends, girlfriends, in some cases people they've only met online. And then those photos spread. I mean, one of the points of this book is that if you digitize something, you have to assume it's not private. Even if it's just on your cell phone, the odds are it will get out somehow. You will want to share it with somebody, or maybe your brother finds your cell phone and does something funky with it. I mean, digitizing anything, an image of yourself, a paper, what have you, makes it that much less likely that you'll control that image. So it's a real risk. one of the things I was interested to discover when I was reading this, or writing this book, is that the issue of sexting has gone one step further. In some relatively rare cases, the initial sexting photos then become an element of blackmail to encourage more explicit photography or even sexual activity. And so this is becoming known as sextortion, as you can kind of see how all these words get built. The most outrageous case was one that took place in Wisconsin, where a young man set up fake Facebook pages pretending to be a girl, and he used that Facebook page to friend boys in his high school because the perpetrator, was interested in other boys. And he used the fake Facebook page to get the boys to sext photos of themselves to an account that he had access to. And then he used those photos to induce actual physical encounters with these boys. And when investigators raided his family's computers, they found more than 300 boys from a handful of high schools in the area who had been sucked into this. And the thing that I think parents need to understand is the speed with which all of this can happen. I mean, how easy it is to go from a relatively innocent photo that you think you're going to share with your boyfriend, with whom you're madly in love, and how fast it goes to something much, much more serious. I mean, that's the thing about the internet and the electronics altogether. It is just such a potential minefield. And we come back to this idea of communication. You know, it's hard to have these conversations with kids, but, you know, for instance, your daughter being 11 and a half is actually at the perfect age to really walk through what the potential consequences are of, number one, creating those kinds of images, and then sharing them with somebody. You know, because the fundamental line here is that if someone is creating and distributing an image of a sexually explicit image of someone, even themselves, under the age of 18, they're violating state and federal child pornography laws. And this state's a little bit more humane about it, in the sense that prosecutors have discretion about how they handle these cases. In the state of Vermont, if you're between the age of 13 and 17 and your partner is in that same range, the prosecutor has the ability to divert it to family court, to juvenile court. And so you remove the potential for sex registry offender status, which is one of the most common outcomes of this. So imagine you've got a 16-year-old boy who takes a photo of his girlfriend and maybe shows it to a buddy or something like that, which is totally predictable, if not honorable, but certainly understandable that he might do that. You know, he has created child pornography, and by showing it to someone, he's a distributor. And typically, distribution statutes have a mandatory minimum sentence. So there's the potential for jail. There's almost certainly the sex offender registry, which means, you know, virtually no college will accept him. Housing restrictions, and then employability issues. So, you know, the risks are profound. And the point of this book was to really make people think about the power of the technology that young kids have access to. The average age for a smartphone with a camera is now below 10, nationwide. So you have basically 9-year-olds, you know, which is 4th grade, running around with a worldwide distribution system in their pocket. So they can snap a photo, they're goofing around at their girlfriend's house, or, you know, they're playing 7 Minutes in Heaven in the closet or something stupid like that. And, you know, boom, a photograph gets taken, and it can go anywhere. You don't know where it's going to go. In a case down in Cincinnati, which was really tragic, involving a young woman named Jessie Logan, she and her boyfriend, I think, exchanged 1 or 2 photos, or she sent her boyfriend, I think it was, a couple of photos of herself. By the time the investigation was completed, they found copies of those photos in 7 different high schools in the Cincinnati area. And she wound up actually going on a local TV show like this to explain what had happened. I mean, she was actually masked, and her voice was masked and all the rest of that. But she was trying to help other kids understand. And it was still emotionally too much for her because she had been harassed by other kids. She had been bullied as a result of these photos. I mean, kids, can be pretty tough. And she ended up committing suicide.
Can we just talk for a second about the addictive part of the internet? Because there's some.
Absolutely.
I've read someplace that the same part of your brain lights up that if you're
Dopamine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's very little question about that. And it's interesting you raised that point, Lauren Glenn, because the publishing company, NTI Upstream, that published this book, was founded by a man named Dr. Ira Chasnoff, who concentrates on kids who have had prenatal exposure to drug and alcohol. And one of the things that they're finding as they research this more intensely is that kind of exposure has a huge range of impacts, as I'm sure you can imagine. But one of the most significant is in an area called executive decision making. The ability to pull together information, understand the consequences, and act upon it. The internet plays directly into that. I mean, even kids with a full range of executive decision making have a hard time with the internet because you don't appreciate how far and how fast things can go.
Well, is that in part because their brain isn't fully developed?
That's partly it. I mean, I'm sure I've heard the studies that suggest, particularly in young men, it's not fully developed till their early 20s, which comes as no shock to a huge number of women altogether.
And in females, it's 21 or 22.
Yeah, and I think guys are actually 4 or 5 years past that or something like that. So there's no question whatsoever that we're putting these communication devices in the hands of people who just are not equipped to really appreciate what could happen. And then on top of that, the design of the internet itself is specifically intended to captivate and to be addictive. I mean, you look at flash games as an example, but even websites and even the act of hypertext, clicking, right? Boom, boom, boom. You can go from one site to the next, never staying at one more than a few seconds. Everything is a constant surge of input. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a hugely addictive quality. And when you watch people who get sucked into World of Warcraft, for instance, or get sucked into really hardcore hacking, it is precisely that kind of addictive quality.
So it sounds like part of the conversation is the conversation you would have with a child about drugs and alcohol.
Absolutely. I think that's fair to say. It's a little bit harder for parents, and I think that this is a real dilemma. Hard to have much upside in terms of illegal drugs. Nobody's going to go out and say heroin has an upside, in any way, shape, or form. I mean, apart from the obvious, temporary rush that is what induces people in the first place, but it's false. And the addictive qualities are profound and so forth. We have a medium here which has tremendous potential and enormous usefulness. And we see it in our schools. It's being woven into the curriculum. So it's hard to say to kids that this is something you should be completely hands-off about, or you shouldn't use it till you're 21, as we do with alcohol, because that doesn't work. That's not the way our society is evolving. So it's hard for parents because it has to be a much more nuanced conversation. It has a lot of positive aspects. Here are the things I want you to use it for. These are the kinds of things you need to be aware of. So,
I might even go so far as to argue that it is something that you shouldn't be using until you're 21.
I think that's a defensible position. I think it's a really hard case to make.
Exactly. Well, it's not practical because it's this siren song that completely surrounds you, and when a child is so intent on growing up, which they want to be grown up, this has now become an emblem of maturity.
Right, and I think that what you're touching upon, which is very, very compelling, is that the internet is accelerating the aging process. Not the maturation process, because that is biological, but it's accelerating the aging process, and kids are being exposed to more adult materials sooner and adult concepts than you and I, for instance, ever were as children. And I'm being presumptuous in terms of age bracket, but I don't think we're terribly far apart. And when we were growing up, there were just things we didn't know about, we didn't see, we didn't have any reason to think about until we were older and we were somewhat more mature. But now, this has been a real issue in our household where we've got a what's the gap actually? We've got a 5-year gap. Yeah, a 5-year gap between the oldest and the youngest. And the youngest is right there with the oldest in terms of what he's exposed to. Mm-hmm. And that's been a huge problem because he's oftentimes age inappropriate. And you could argue that the 18-year-olds are too, but there's no question the 13-year-old is definitely age appropriate. And the more unsupervised time the kids have on the internet or with cell phones, because there's almost no distinction, the more that's going to happen. And I think that's the real issue. One of the hardest parts of this is that, you talk about TV restrictions. That's easy because it's a big box in one location most of the time. Maybe there's another TV in your bedroom or something like that. But it's a limited pool of devices. The internet is exploding in terms of devices. Probably in a lot of middle-class households, you've got a computer for each person in the household, if not plus. Smartphone, probably, for most of the people in the house, depending on their age. Now iPads are coming in. So when you look at the number of devices that can get on the internet in your home, it's not surprising that kids are spending huge amounts of time on the internet. So I'm not even sure you could realistically say to your 11-year-old, you can use the internet like 5 hours a week. I think you'd have a real fight on your hands.
Well, and I think, everything, it's so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But the bigger, it's just so powerful.
Yes, it is incredibly powerful.
And it's hard when you are not practiced in having a conversation to know what to say.
Yeah, and I think actually, the plug for this book, honestly, is that I think that this helps educate parents not only about the dangers, but also about the kinds of conversations to have. Because when you read through this book, you get a real insight to the kinds of issues and how they arise, so that you can start asking questions of your kid, or you can give them chapters of this book. It's very straightforward in terms of how I wrote it. So, have a child sit down and read the chapter on cyberbullying, and then you can really have a conversation about, how does this happen? Have you experienced it? Do you see any of your friends doing this? Do you understand what the impact is on other people? How would you handle it if someone asked you to forward a message that was hurtful, or if you got a message that was hurtful? And so I think that there really are tools in this book that make it less daunting. The biggest part of what I think is daunting to parents oftentimes is the technology itself.
Right.
That we don't have that exposure that the kids do to this stuff. And that's what I'm trying to remedy here, is to really help parents understand what the devices are that kids are using, how they're using them, and then really some of the things that can be done to minimize the risk. It's not perfect. It's not going to be, because as you point out, it is ubiquitous. But the more education the parents have, the easier it is to talk to kids.
One of the things you mentioned before we went on the air is the case of the Congressman Anthony Weiner.
That's right.
Which seems like a bad combination of addiction and bad training. I mean, and just sheer stupidity.
Door number 3, I think.
So I mean, here's a man. He's a grown-up.
Yes.
He's taking pictures. He's exposing himself.
Yes.
Online.
Yes.
He's a person with political power, and this act undoes him politically. Mm-hmm. Right. So what are the lessons that you can take from that experience, or what a parent can take?
It's a great question. Actually, when that incident arose, I put out a press release entitled "The Top 5 Things That Representative Weiner Can Teach Your Children." And I put that on my website, which is fredricklane.com. And there's a menu item for press releases, and if people go to that, they can read this. But the gist of it boiled down to that, number one, if it's digital, it's public. I mean, what Representative Weiner did was really, really dumb, because he thought he was sending a private message. But he overlooked the fact that even if it had been private, and he screwed that up, but even if it had been private, he was still sending an electronic file to someone he really didn't know, who could then copy it, who could forward it, who could repost it to Twitter, who could do any number of things. And so that's the fundamental lesson, that if you're creating a digital image of yourself, it can potentially go around the world in minutes. You know the phrase going viral. That's exactly what happened to his initial, gray boxer short photo or whatever. The other thing is, and this is what this book tries to get to a little bit, is that it's so easy to make a stupid mistake. I mean, as you say, Representative Weiner was one of our kind of more technologically savvy representatives, and he still made the mistake of, instead of putting the letter D, which is for a direct message on Twitter, he put the @ symbol, which means basically that you're saying hello or you're identifying another user, but the message is part of the public feed. And so that's what happened. That photo, instead of just being sent to one person, was sent to everybody, which incidentally, I'm sure this galls him no end, which means he's now part of the Library of Congress, which is archiving all of Twitter as we speak. So there's that. And then, some of the other lessons I think that, parents definitely need to take away from this is the speed with which everything can happen. That kids need to understand that crises on the internet are never slow moving. They're always at light speed. And so that's critically important, that you will cause damage, and you will cause damage very, very quickly. And so that's important. I think that the other lesson, and then folks can read the rest, is that it's hard to do when you're young. But one of the questions you should ask yourself before you post something online or you send a message on Facebook is this going to hurt someone? Is this going to hurt me? Is it going to hurt my family if someone reads that? I've had issues in the past with my younger son, who would occasionally post things on Facebook in language that, let's say, was not appropriate for a 12 or 13-year-old to post. And it was useful, and it has slowly made a difference for me to be able to say, your grandmother reads what you post on Facebook. Is this, would you say this to her in public, in person? And, of course, the typical snarky 13-year-old response is, well, sure. But he doesn't really mean it. And you come to appreciate that that's not what people want to see. So, those are not fun conversations, because no 13-year-old likes to be corrected. But that's the point. And so this actually gets to another piece of this, Lauren Glenn, that, once you've had the conversation and done the work to figure out what your child is doing online, there is some responsibility to monitor that. So, for instance, if your child has a Facebook account, which technically they're not supposed to under the age of 13, but that's widely ignored, if they have a Facebook account, a rule of using the computer should be, I'm your friend, and I get complete access to your account. And beyond that, I'm not just your friend, but I want your password. Because there are some things that you can only see if you go into her account as her. And that is it's just a given. In exchange for using this incredibly powerful tool, that's what I need in order to feel comfortable as your parent, that I can help keep an eye on what's going on.
And then at what point do you then cede the authority? Are they 18? Are they, you sort of figure it out as you go along?
It's not a bright line by any stretch of the imagination. And as I'm sure you know, with different kids, they mature at different rates, or they seem more responsible at different ages. I think it really is, well, here's the thing. My last book, which I think you and I talked about at one point, was American Privacy. And my younger son in particular gets very huffy about this, and he's already a big constitutional scholar. He's very insistent on the full panoply of his constitutional rights. And my response to him consistently is, you're a child. You don't have this right. Or you only have a diminished version of it because you're not an adult. And so what parents really need to come back to, I think, and it's hard because our generation resists this, but we need to come back to the sense that children have no right to privacy. And the internet, I think, underscores the importance of that the right to privacy is actually a privilege. It is a constitutional right, I believe, when we get into adulthood. That's a whole different discussion. But for children, it's a privilege rather than a right. And so as they get older, and as they demonstrate maturity and responsibility in terms of how they act, then you give them more privacy. And that's actually appropriate, because we don't want to raise a generation of children, and I worry about this, where they're used to the idea of surveillance. And that may be unavoidable. I mean, you look around the building, even downstairs, you've got surveillance. We've got surveillance on school buses and stuff like that. So they're obviously approaching it from a very different perspective than our generation. But from a parenting point of view, I actually do think it's appropriate to say you have a diminished right to privacy. Not only can you get into trouble, but you can get the whole family into trouble by what you do. And that actually gives me an opportunity to underscore one thing. There's a class of software, peer-to-peer software, which is LimeWire. You'll see it, BitTorrents is another manifestation of this. By and large, my recommendation to parents is get it off the computer. There's almost no valid reason to have peer-to-peer or BitTorrent software except for downloading illegal music and potentially bringing child pornography into the house, either intentionally or accidentally. And once that happens, all bets are off, because law enforcement can monitor the transmission of those files in real time, and they can literally see where those files are going on a Google-style map. And so all they have to do is then fill in a search warrant and show up, and they can examine every electronic device in the house. It's really just, I understand the appeal of it, but it is tremendously dangerous.
I think just in closing, the flip side is that we in this culture need to do a better job of letting children just be children.
I agree with that. I think that it depends on what our definition of being children is. I think that where I would take your comment, and I think it's a good one, is that these are adult tools, ultimately. And I think their desire to use them is speeding up the quest for adulthood. The being children part, I mean, God, I have this kind of sylvan remembrance of my childhood where we'd play Frisbee until it was too dark to see, or wiffle ball or whatever in the streets. And, there was nothing like this. It's a very different world altogether. I don't think that there's an intrinsic problem with kids socializing online and being kids in that sense. But I think we need to be aware that these devices have adult consequences, even if the user is a child. And it's a hard lesson for parents to think about, but the time really is now to start appreciating that.
Well, Cybertraps for the Young is the book, and where can people get this, Fred?
Between now and August 15th, they can order it from the website of the publisher, ntiupstream.com. It's right on the front page. And as of August 15th, it'll be on Amazon.
And they can come to your website and learn more as well.
Absolutely.
Fredlane?
FrederickLane.com.
FrederickLane.com. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren.
For all your work blazing the trail for all of us.
Appreciate it.
We've been speaking with Frederick Lane, who just completed Cybertraps for the Young. It's his 6th book. He not only is a author on this subject, but is a computer forensic expert. So he's been deep diving into the computer world for a long time.
Indeed, I have.
So thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. Stay tuned and stay cool in your house here at Channel 17.